distributed equally. To build resilient societies, we will explore innovative strategies for integrating gender-responsive and inclusive approaches into disaster risk governance. You may notice some empty chairs on stage. They are for the panel session after the plenary remarks. Now let's get started by watching a short video that shows an overview of our plenary topic today.
We can all contribute to reducing disaster risk. Our diverse experiences, skills, and knowledge can be harnessed to make communities more resilient. When gender equality is prioritized, women, girls, and people of diverse genders are prepared for disasters, and everyone benefits from their contributions and leadership. When persons with disabilities are part of infrastructure design and decision-making, sustainability, resilience, and accessibility grow. When local, indigenous, and traditional knowledge is foregrounded in prevention and mitigation, our environments thrive. When we invest in the untapped potential of children and youth, we usher in a future that's sustainable, equitable, and resilient for all. Governments and other stakeholders have shared responsibility to prevent new risks and reduce existing ones. Inclusive disaster risk governance is indispensable. Our policies, decisions, and financing must reflect this fact. We all have a role to play. What will yours be? Let's protect our future together. Leave no one behind.
To kick off our session, I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker to deliver her plenary remarks. She headed the Philippine delegation to the Disaster World Risk Reduction in Sendai, Japan in 2015. The Honorable Lauren Legarda, Senator of the Philippines.
Thank you very much, and welcome to all the ministers and officials from the Asia Pacific, and of course our Secretary of National Defense, Gilbert Teodoro, and all the officials of the Philippine government as well, and advocates of disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. Excellencies, it is an honor to address this session on ensuring that no one is left behind in disaster risk reduction, a goal central to the Sendai Framework. And just before this meeting in the holding area, we were wondering, what are we doing post-Sendai in 2030? And I'm sure the UNDRR based in Geneva, regional office in Bangkok, are already planning the post-Sendai framework in 2030, which is just 5 years away. In the Asia-Pacific region, disasters disproportionately affect women, girls, persons with disabilities, even indigenous peoples, 15 million of whom are in the Philippines, and marginalized communities. Women, who make up 70% of the world's poor, are often the hardest hit. Persons with disabilities are up to 4 times more likely to die during disasters. Clearly, inclusivity is not a choice. It is a necessity if we are to build truly resilient societies. Gender-responsive disaster risk governance recognizes that women and girls are not merely victims. We are leaders and agents of change. Globally, 1 in 5 girls is married before the age of 18. Girls are nearly twice as likely to miss out on education as boys. These girls already have a vision for a future where they can thrive, and our role is to ensure that they have the resources, the education, and leadership opportunities to turn that vision into reality. Beyond inclusion, women, girls, and all marginalized groups must harness their creativity and ingenuity, and even use innovation and new technology to lead sustainable solutions to our most pressing development challenges, from achieving a just transition to a low-carbon world, to building safer schools and hospitals, more secure communities, both in cities and in the hinterlands. Their contributions are essential. In the Philippines, we've enshrined gender equality in most, if not all, of our laws. Way back, the Magna Carta of Women. In 2010, the Philippine Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Act, which, upon consultation with D&D Secretary Sec Teodoro and his team, we hope to amend and revise to make it more up-to-date, since it's a 15-year-old law. These are laws I've championed in my over 25 years in the Senate, the longest senator who's been there, but not the oldest. These are the laws that we have authored for the protection and empowerment of women in disaster contexts. We also have the Climate Change Act way back in 2009, when nobody or very few actually understood and cared about climate change adaptation and mitigation and disaster risk reduction and resilience, which this representation has been advocating since the 1990s. And I am certain that many of you feel the same way in your respective communities, organizations, or institutions. The Climate Change Act, which created a small commission of government, but chaired by no less than the President of the Republic of the Philippines. And I believe it was this time when the President of our Republic now, President Marcos, was my colleague in the Senate. And he would be one of the very few who would actually sit and listen intently and agree with me on the importance of climate change adaptation, mitigation, resilience, and everything I said from more than 15 years ago. And so, eventually, we enacted the Climate Change Act, creating the Climate Change Commission, the lead policy-making body on climate change. And we also included that there must be a woman in the commission, ensuring gender representation at the highest level of decision-making. Just an anecdote, there was a provision called the People's Survival Fund. During debates then, more than 15 years ago, I was then a young senator, and a more senior senator asked that it be excluded. One step backward, two steps forward. I agreed with a heavy heart that the People's Survival Fund provision would be excluded just to pass my pet bill of Climate Change Act into law. This was way back 2007. Compromise. So it was enacted without much funding. But in the next Congress, I and then Senate President Enrile filed the People's Survival Fund, which I sponsored as chair of the Climate Change Committee, enacted into law, and when I was not yet in the Finance Committee, the funding was 50 million. When I chaired the Finance Committee, I made it 1 billion, and that is ensured every year for local government units. At the same time, disability-inclusive governance is equally critical. Persons with disabilities must be included in all stages of disaster risk management, from risk assessment to recovery. We must ensure that early warning systems, evacuation procedures, recovery plans are accessible to everyone, removing each and every barrier that prevents full participation, especially in an archipelago of 110 million Filipinos in the most far-flung islands and the highest mountains, with inland rivers and lakes. It is not easy to cascade the information of early warning systems, while we have the Pag-asa, which is the Weather Bureau, so to speak, and we were able to secure funding from the Green Climate Fund when I was sitting as a member of the board. But then it takes so long, and it is really a challenge to convey the information for preparedness, to reduce risk to each and every island of more than 7,000 islands and the mountains as well, and in communities which are far, far away. Evacuation procedures is another challenge. As we were talking with a team of Sec Teodoro, unless you say, you will die if you don't leave this place, some will take the risk because they say they've been used to that anyway. So I'm diverting from my speech. I will read again. So leaving no one behind must drive the renovation of risk governance. We must take a look at hazards, risks, and vulnerabilities. Women, girls, persons with disabilities, indigenous peoples, communities, marginalized groups must be at the heart of shaping the post-2030 disaster risk governance framework, post-Sendai, ensuring their leadership in building truly resilient and inclusive systems. Resilience cannot be achieved by working in silos. And this, again, I say in front of government officials, that is sometimes the greatest barrier. Government sometimes are very exclusive to each other and not inclusive. Kanya-kanya, in the Tagalog word, to each his own. And that will spell disaster. Governments, the private sector, civil society, local communities, the education sector, all must collaborate to create inclusive and innovative solutions. Most importantly, local communities who are on the front lines, whether you are in the provincial level, city, municipality, even barangay, purok, and sitio, at the front lines of preparedness and disaster response in the whole scheme of things, but to follow the maps that show no-build zones and to follow DRR laws and procedures up to the local level. And they must be empowered with the resources, with the education, with all the measures to build capacity. In closing, as we surge towards 2030, we must urgently transform risk governance to confront the complex challenges of our time. Amplifying the voices of the neglected and the unheard is key to building a future where everyone is empowered and no one is left behind. Now is a time for bold, inclusive action to forge a safer and more resilient world for all. We must not just build back better, but build right at first sight. Thank you. Isang lunti ang Pilipinas sa ating lahat.
Thank you, Senator Legarda. Please join me in welcoming our second plenary remarks speaker, Honorable Gilberto C. Teodoro Jr., Secretary, Department of National Defense, Chairperson of the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council of the Philippines, and co-chair of the 2024 APMC DRR.
Thank you. The Honorable Senator Loren Legarda, our disaster risk reduction champion in the Senate and in her advocacies. Excellencies present today and other members of the Diplomatic Corps, speakers and our moderators, colleagues in government, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, a pleasant good morning to each and every one of you. I would not like to miss the moment, and I would like to move on from the speech of Senator Legarda, if you would permit me to digress a bit, because it highlights something very important in the Philippine experience. What I would like to underscore is the synergy between our policymakers and our legislators and us in the executive branch of government that are supposed to make things happen based on the laws that they pass. What she has underscored, the distinguished senator has underscored, is the value of feedback, constant feedback between our legislators and our action institutions, of which the Office of Civil Defense and the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council are part of. Hence, in this interaction between the legislators and us, it prevents the siloing because they are a source of important feedback and vice versa. Senator Legarda has underscored that our current disaster risk reduction law was enacted 15 years ago, and it is time for a review. Because of changing circumstances, because of experiences in the field, we have been able to identify some gaps that need to be filled, some streamlining that needs to be done. And this is a constant exercise that should happen in most areas of government, but it is critical that it happens in disaster risk reduction in order to optimize and to focus government efforts in all aspects of the topic. So we thank our Senate partner and champion, Senator Legarda, for her advocacies. Let's give her a big hand. To go on to the meat of what we want to say today, I would like to begin my remarks with a fundamental premise that guides our, perhaps all of us, disaster risk reduction efforts. Hazards do not affect people equally and countries equally. President Ferdinand R. Marcos Jr. acknowledged this fact in his address at the 77th United Nations General Assembly, where he spoke of the uneven and historically unjust effects of climate change. This is exemplified here in the Philippines, which has the potential to become a net carbon sink, yet remains one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change. At the national level, the Philippine Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Act of 2010, with its implementing rules and regulations, recognizes, and I quote, vulnerable and marginalized groups, unquote, who have a higher exposure to disaster risk and poverty. These include women, especially those who are with child, the youth, particularly orphans and unaccompanied minors, the elderly, persons with disabilities, indigenous peoples, and families and individuals who live in high-risk areas, danger zones, and other places that are susceptible to industrial, environmental, and health hazards. This is by no means an exhaustive list. What this illustrates, however, is that certain sectors of the Filipino population are definitely more vulnerable than others and require greater support from the government and other key stakeholders. In the face of these realities, we have worked very hard through the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council to create a gender-responsive, data-driven, and inclusive approach and management system for disaster risk reduction. This has been approached in three ways. First, we emphasize local resilience to include capacity building for the local units for data collection and vertical and horizontal integration between these local units and the national government for collation and analysis of data for the optimal application of resource management. As the national government builds its data backbone, we will be more able to predict quicker what is needed where and how much. We have to understand too that we have to take into account the specific characteristics of local communities which differ. Sometimes in one local government unit alone, there are several phenomena which affect these communities. We have strengthened our information gathering and analysis capabilities, although the pace of development far outruns our capability development. And therefore, in order to plug this gap, we invite civil society, private organizations, individual supports. We opened recently what we termed the El Niño portal for giving in data, and a secure site in that portal is for the use of the local government units where they can tap national government data for their local planning. We were supposed to convert this into the La Niña portal. However, we have decided in the council to make this a full-time disaster risk reduction portal for a secure site where local government units and other national government agencies can exchange data feedback, and the local governments can have weather data, tidal data, and other data they need, and send messages to us. It has worked quite well in the El Niño. However, we are still encouraging more informed and responsible public involvement with the portal to make it a full convergent site. We have broadened stakeholder engagement. We have encouraged the involvement of civil society representatives and the private sector. Private sector, as you saw yesterday in the session with Arise Foundation and the PDRF, corporate ESG is practiced in the country extensively, and we are not merely trying to build a framework for cooperation with the private sector on the response side, but more importantly on the mitigation and preparation side by way of giving incentives for adequate and resilient infrastructure and a development plan, which will include necessities for disaster risk reduction and taking into account the needs of the youth, women, and those who are disabled. It is also a challenge policy-wise, particularly in old historic communities, to introduce disaster risk reduction efforts in order to make places more accessible and safe. It is a challenge, and therefore we invite the youth in terms of the technological advances that can be made without destroying historic sites, where we can make the places safer for people who need more. We have worked with financial institutions because at the end of the day, what we are talking about reduces itself into how much and where do we get the money. And that is our job in government. So we have been trying to be more creative in raising financing for disaster risk reduction in its various aspects. Of course, the government can incentivize adherence and buy-in through proper incentives. However, it will affect the fiscal bottom line. So we will have to make optimal choices, perhaps. I wouldn't say hard choices, because choices need to be made. And using the adjective hard before choice often leads to no choice at all and empty promises. So we do need to make choices, and we hope that the choices are justified by data. At the regional level, we have collaborated with other governments and international organizations, including the United Nations and ASEAN. And we hope to build extra-regional bridges, because the world is one when we talk or we speak of disaster risk reduction. There should be no borders, neither borders nor boundaries. The Philippines is uniquely situated to have strong ties with the Asia-Pacific region, both Asia and the Pacific Islands, of which we both are part of. We have strong ties with Europe, in keeping with the Filipino tradition of welcoming interaction and cooperation. And in this important aspect of national and world life, we think that it is a great responsibility of government to build bridges in order for us to help each other, not only through exchanges of information, best practices, but actual help in times of need or even before that. The Philippines commits itself to the Sendai Framework and Sustainable Development Goals, which we have included in our National DRRM Plan 2020 to 2030. We prioritize localization as a key strategy. We are addressing and trying to give resources to raising awareness on the Sendai Gap, or the Sendai Gender Action Plan. Likewise, we are trying now to build an initiative of culling our own local experiences to provide a nuance to the various frameworks that we are working with. Because at the end of the day, I believe that it is important to instill, once again, because when we talk of local units, normally we, insofar as I'm concerned, and perhaps others are concerned, we have a tendency to view these units as political and democratic entities. But what we need to be building here when we talk of localities is the sense of community, the sense of kinship within a community, familiarity with each other, which we hope will develop conditioned responses when they face one phenomenon. And this is the spirit of community, and probably the spirit of what we call bayanihan, and the spirit of the barangay, that we need to reinstill in some way or another. In the face of rapidly developing areas, commercial establishments, commerce and housing areas rising up, I hope that there is some way where our local leaders can redevelop the community spirit of familiarity and of awareness of each other's well-being in the community. At the end of the day, that is where we all come from. The communities working together within themselves and with one another. And in those paradigms of communities, you will know how to take care of those who are different from you, how you respect and deal with those who are different from you, and then go up through vertical integration, and us in government, we horizontally integrate in order for there to be a whole ecosystem of disaster risk reduction activities and thoughts within the whole national community and the world community. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you had a wonderful conference so far.
Thank you very much, Secretary Teodoro. Now we will transition to the panel discussion. Our moderator for Pillar 2 Plenary leads one of the organization's largest divisions that support Pacific countries and territories with special scientific and technical solutions to address some of the region's greatest challenges. It is my pleasure to introduce Rhonda Robinson, Director, Geoscience, Energy, and Maritime Division of Pacific Community.
Excellencies, ministers, senior officials, partners, colleagues, all protocol observed. Nisam Bulavinaka, and good morning. And given the theme of today's plenary, I might want to just do things a little bit differently this morning and ask that each of you turn to the person sitting beside you and say, in whatever language you'd like to use, good morning to each other. Thank you everyone. As we gather here at this second plenary on this critical subject of leaving no one behind, gender responsive and inclusive disaster risk governance, our discussions today will focus on practical solutions to enhance disaster risk reduction financing, ensuring that that very theme we're talking about of leaving no one behind is achieved. We'll hear from a selection of very distinguished speakers who will share their insights and experiences on how we are collectively working towards achieving this goal. Things such as adaptive social protection related to disaster risk reduction financing, especially in the anticipatory action and pre-agreed financing mechanisms, will be shared. Originally conceived as bringing together social protection, disaster risk reduction, and climate change, adaptive social protection has evolved to adapt to multiple shocks a community might face. I don't want to take too much away from what the panelists will be speaking to, and at this juncture, I do want to invite our panel members up to join me here at the top podium. I assure you, it's not that scary. There are a few people in the room today, and with that, can I please invite our first distinguished panel member, Honorable Diana Kahipe, who is the Undersecretary for the Disaster Response Management Group of the Department of Social Welfare and Development here in the Philippines. Welcome, Diana. Our second panel member is Mr. Pio Smith, who serves as the Regional Director for Asia and the Pacific for the United Nations Population Fund, UNFPA. Welcome, Pio. I did ask Pio whether he was from Fiji. Pio is a very common name in Fiji, and he assured me that he isn't. He's from Ireland. Welcome, Pio. Our third distinguished panel member is Caspar Fasala, who is the CEO of People with Disability Forum, Solomon Islands. Welcome, Caspar. Our fourth distinguished panel member is Nayab Ali, and she is the National Technical Program Specialist, Peace and Justice Network, Pakistan. Welcome, Nayab. And our fifth panelist is Ambassador Christian Tilley, who is Australia's Ambassador for Climate Change. Welcome, Christian. Thank you. So we'll just get this going. My first question is going to be directed at you, Diana, who we're asking to please share with us how is the government of Philippines scaling up social protection systems to better respond to disasters and bolster disaster resilience of the highly vulnerable groups. The floor is yours.
The Philippine government has taken significant steps to enhance its social protection systems in response to disasters, particularly under the leadership of the Department of Social Welfare and Development, which serves as the Vice Chair for Response of the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council. DSWD plays a pivotal role in disaster preparedness, response, and recovery, ensuring that the most vulnerable sectors of society, such as women, children, elderly, and the poor, receive timely and appropriate assistance in times of crisis. Our country's commitment to building resilience is reflected in DSWD's integration of adaptive, shock-responsive social protection systems into our existing programs. This approach not only targets emergency relief, but also proactively supports vulnerable populations to recover and build resilience against future shocks. We have been working towards the horizontal and vertical expansion of our interventions by reviewing targeting mechanisms, capacitating personnel, looking into benefit value, tweaking program designs, and enhancing delivery systems. The project Local Adaptation to Water Access and Breaking Insufficiency through Nutritious Harvest for the Impoverished, or the Project Lawa and Binhi, aims to enhance the capacities of local community members, called partner beneficiaries, through a sustainable and proactive intervention to combat hunger, alleviate codependency, and lower community vulnerability by addressing food insecurity and water scarcity worsened by changing climate patterns that could lead to full-scale disasters. Now implemented nationwide, Project Lawa and Binhi has developed into a sustainable three-stage approach within a targeted yet inclusive climate change and risk mitigation strategy, aiming to benefit partner beneficiaries with long-term solutions for water sufficiency and food security. The implementation of the Building on Social Protection for Anticipatory Action and Response in Emergencies and Disasters, or the Be Spared pilot project, endeavors at preparing poor agricultural communities ahead of a hazard through livelihood assets protection and anticipatory multi-purpose cash transfers with 3 hazard types, which include agricultural drought, typhoons, and floods. The Be Spared project has been instrumental in integrating pre-agreed triggers for disaster response using data from our national science-based agencies to activate early actions based on forecasts. Flexible cash enables households to decide on their necessities to prepare for any scenario pre-disaster, thereby providing them with economic empowerment. The Children's Emergency Relief and Protection Act mandates the provision of emergency relief and protection for children before, during, and after disasters and other emergencies. Through this law, the DSWD spearheaded the formulation of the Comprehensive Emergency Program for Children as the basis of government, child-focused civil society organizations, and non-government agencies' roles and responsibilities upon the declaration of a state of calamity in handling disasters and emergencies for children, children with special needs, pregnant and lactating mothers to support their immediate recovery. The DSWD Social Protection Plan 2023 to 2028 includes capacitating child social welfare workforce in the regional and local levels and establishing a standard child-friendly and gender-responsive evacuation centers and transitional shelters nationwide. Likewise, we have conducted the implementation of the UNICEF Central Emergency Response Fund Anticipatory Action, or the UNICEF SURF-AA, which is a pilot concept which provided anticipatory cash assistance for children by top-ups from the DSWD's Pantawid Pamilyang Pilipino program beneficiaries cash card accounts prior to the impact of a tropical cyclone. Our innovations through consultations and insights from multi-level stakeholders helped us in localization of international frameworks to our national frameworks that fits our country's capacity and context. The enhancement of the predictive analytics for humanitarian response online mapping platform tool was supported by our UN partners from the UN and bolstered with institutional and local capabilities in geographic information systems with robust and pertinent data and data sets to identify communities in need and strategically provide appropriate interventions prior to the onset of disasters. The DSWD Disaster Response Command Center serves as the central hub for coordinating disaster response and recovery efforts using advanced technology and real-time data to allocate resources effectively. This strengthened our capacity for information and database management, especially on disaggregated data, to increase effectiveness, timeliness, and better decision-making. Our mobile command centers are customized vehicles with ICT equipments which bridge communication gaps during emergencies, linking our field operations to regional centers and ensuring continuous telecommunication support. The Buong Bansa Handa program strengthens disaster resilience through a coordinated humanitarian supply chain for food and non-food items. It focuses on prepositioning relief goods in vulnerable areas, ensuring swift distribution during crisis, and promoting not just a whole-of-government approach, but a whole-of-society approach to disaster preparedness and response. The initiatives to champion the passing of the Declaration of the State of Imminent Disaster Bill, while also advancing the adoption of shock-responsive social protection in the Philippines, will involve strategically linking anticipatory action interventions with existing social protection programs and technologies to enhance their effectiveness, ensuring a cohesive approach to disaster management and climate change adaptation. To sustain and scale up our initiatives, we have forged strong partnerships with international organizations such as the FAO, the UNICEF, the World Food Programme, International Organization for Migration, United Nations Population Fund, and the World Bank. These collaborations provide technical support, funding, and trainings for our department and to local government units as well. We likewise recognize the importance of community-based disaster risk reduction and management. Filipino communities have ingenious coping mechanisms, resilience, and the bayanihan spirit that we consider as one of our most valuable attributes. The Philippines is continuously making significant strides in enhancing its gender-responsive and disability-inclusive disaster risk governance by strengthening collaboration with local and international partners, integrating anticipatory action mechanisms, using forecast-based financing, and with continued innovations in adaptive, shock-responsive social protection systems to improve our disaster management framework that serves the most vulnerable communities, ensuring that all Filipinos are prepared and supported in times of crisis so that no one is left behind.
Thank you. Can we get a round of applause for Diana? I'd like to just maybe reference a few things in response to your reflections today. And one is the use of these, innovative tools and approaches that we're currently employing in this space. Predictive analytics for humanitarian response, as an example. And the real need to reconcile the use of these tools with the realities of our people on the ground and the vulnerabilities that they really face, and bringing the two together. So thank you for that. And just in response to all of our very honorable speakers from the Government of Philippines today is the need to ensure we're taking an all of a society approach and not just an all of government approach. And that's something that's come through quite strongly across the two keynote speakers and yourself, Diana. So thank you. Naka. Casper, I'd like to turn to you now for the next question and for your reflections. In the midterm review of the Sendai Framework, member states have reported that national DRR plans and institutional frameworks are increasingly addressing the specific needs of women, children and youth, persons with disabilities, older persons, indigenous peoples, migrant and displaced persons. However, we know gaps still remain in the implementation of these plans and frameworks. How is your organization involved in planning and designing DRR initiatives in the Solomon Islands? And what barriers still exist for persons with disabilities in leading these efforts? The floor is yours, Caspar.
Thank you. Well, thank you first of all, and I wish to acknowledge the government and the people of Philippines for the hospitality and invitation to be here, and UNDRR to be with the panel. First of all, I would like to make mention here that the shift of charity and medical models of disability is long gone, and therefore the approach now is social and the human rights approach models that are needed to be considered, and therefore I hope that I will make some reference to that in terms of leave no one behind. But yet the challenges faced by disabilities are noted when looking at the Sendai Framework. One is that disabilities are compounded by experiences of poverty and isolation still. The other is they face greater issues accessing to warnings and emergency information. And thirdly, reaching humanitarian support in many of disasters is yet to be addressed by policies and, of course, reality in practical sense on the ground when disaster hits Solomon Islands and any country for that matter, if I may say. Fourthly, the planned relocation to climate change is predicted to increase in Solomon Islands, efforts to adopt in place, but yet I think there is a slow process in putting that to practice in terms of its policies. But again, the processes of relocation is yet to be heard, and the voices of people with disabilities in the process needs to be considered as well. Finally, I would like also to raise as challenges to that is we need to ensure rights-based approaches are considered to ensure affected communities, people with disabilities have a voice in those processes. I would like, in this respect, would like to again address the issue of using languages. There are many policies that use the language of cross-cutting and, of course, use the language of mainstreaming. But taking note that when you look at the twin approach on addressing the needs of disabilities, one need to consider specific needs of people with disabilities, and you can consider mainstreaming and cross-cutting in terms of policies, but when you address those in terms of providing technical support, I think we need not to consider cross-cutting because you can't cut people in half and address the other half. We're all human beings. Let me now share some experiences in moving forward. When you address myself coming in to the platform, you address us as the representing the National Disability Forum, and this is the shift because of the charity model and the medical model that have shifted. We have now changed the name of the organization from Disabled People's Association of Solomon Islands to be now the National Disability Forum, so that we can consider more broadly issues affecting people, not only people with disabilities, but of course caregivers, supporters, and those around them in their families, and acknowledge the two first speakers of the Philippine practical programs that they have given us in the opening speeches. The ideology in the Solomon Islands, if I may say, having caused those changes is that in the past 20 years, the organization has been in the back of the vehicle, not on the vehicle, but at the back of the vehicle, pushing the vehicle in terms of getting the government who drives the vehicle with the passengers of government people sitting at the back of the vehicle, and we are standing at the back of the vehicle to push. And that is the advocacy we took in the past. Now it is a change. When a call for the change of the disability policy to be more inclusive, we have to intervene and to ask the government, can we please come in the vehicle with you? And therefore, with external support, we have managed to support the government in reviewing and changing the policy that now it is not a policy on disability, but it's now a policy that refers to people with disabilities on a broader sense, inclusive development policy, so to speak. That is the first change we have made to ensure that disability is not being just a person, but has needs to be addressed. The second, again, the swift shift that we supported the government because the government was slow in ratifying the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. It took almost 20 years to lobby for that, and that is the lobbying exercise we do in pushing the vehicle. So we lobby for support externally, got support because the government questioned us as to the benefits of ratifying the convention. We justify that by ensuring that there is a benefit analysis taken and to make sure that government ratifies the convention. Thanks Solomon government for ratifying the convention last year on the 22nd of June, 2023. And that's the effort we did in supporting that exercise to make sure rights-based approaches are considered. And that's the ideology we use, not to push the vehicle anymore. And now we are saying to the government, please allow us to sit in front of you, or sometimes we take the front seat with you and to become the driver. And so far, we become the driver now in influencing and advising the government in terms of legislations and policies to make sure that we have inclusive policies, and that I'm happy to say here that there are many policies that the government has reviewed and now inclusive in terms of the policies. But I hope that those policies are tagged with monetary support so that those strategies are meaningful and are supported in terms of implementation of those strategies. It is now the we and not the I anymore. What is the new outlook in terms of addressing these things now is that we have now changed in terms of our units of the organization. We now have a number of units to address specific programs for us. We have the Disaster and Climate Change Unit comprising of 3 staffs. We have a unit of programs that look after our 6 affiliates. Currently, we have 6 affiliates comprising of the blind and vision impaired. We have the Solomon Islands Deaf Association. We have the Disability Women's Empowerment Association. We have the youth and para-athletes. We have another group now in this year, including the psychosocial groupings. And finally, this year as well, we now have brought up the 6th member organization to be called the elders and old people. But when we strike their constitution, they don't want to be called old people, so we changed the name now to Pioneer of the Families. A national dialogue, of course, is going to be happen before end of this year, end of this month with the government. And this is a government commitment to ensure that the shift is meaningful, and therefore that is going to happen in terms of ensuring the government has a commitment to their policies and tag monetary to it to support the budget, which is now at its cycle. Probably finally, I would like just to raise 2 barriers that sometimes people use, but we use that as not a barrier, but something that will give us strength. Talking to people, they said, of course, the first barrier is attitude, but I think with attitude, it is called for more meaningful dialogue, and of course, for more meaningful planning, and the processes must be, of course, a participatory process and inclusion of people with disabilities. And therefore, attitude is not so much in terms of negativity, but it pushes our organization to see the positive side of it and to unlock that. And therefore, it calls for us now to have more dialogue with the government, with institutions around us that support us, and in order to bring meaningful changes to the programs that we also complement. One of the barriers, again, the second barrier is people use in terms of the disability language is stigma. But I think the wisdom is here that we use stigma as a call for duty of care and responsibility. Because if we care and love people, for sure there should be no stigma. And that is something that we use stigma positively to increase our programs and to call for citizenship responsibility in order for people to ensure that they are called for duty and responsibility. Finally, we want to translate the DRR, the disaster risk reduction. We want to interpret this in terms of disability to make it a call to be a dignified, responsive, resilient program for disabilities and all in Solomon Islands. Thank you so much. God bless you.
Thank you, Tomas, Caspar. And just across the philosophy, the approach, the advocacy, we've seen some real gains in the reflection that you've shared in the risk governance space for Solomon Islands, in policy, in legislation, in strategy, by not only ensuring representation, but real recognition of persons with disabilities in the risk governance space for Solomon Islands. And for that, I think we should commend you and give you another round of applause in collaboration with all the partners and government officials that have got there, NACPA level. I now turn to our next panel member, P.O. Smith, for the next question and reflection. In the midterm review of the Sendai Framework, most countries acknowledged that gender equality and social inclusion are key priorities to accelerate implementation of the framework. Earlier this year, the Gender Action Plan for the Sendai Framework was launched to help member states and other DRR stakeholders increase resource allocations, activities, and impacts of gender-responsive disaster risk reduction and sustainably decrease gender-related disaster risk by 2030. What, in your opinion, needs to shift to support implementation of the Sendai Framework Gender Action Plan? And how is UNFPA in particular supporting this implementation across Asia, the Asia-Pacific region? The floor is yours.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Rhonda. And firstly, also greetings, everybody. And it's a great honor to be at this conference. I want to pay tribute to the government of the Philippines and also to our colleagues in the office of DRR. And it's great to also share this panel with very passionate and expert speakers. You know, I think the first thing I want to say is that the backdrop, Rhonda, for this discussion, for this conference, for everything actually that we're trying to do these days, the backdrop is that we are living in a world where there is a steady and regressive pushback, rollback on women's rights. It is pervasive. It is not just in Afghanistan or in North Korea. It is not just in Asia Pacific. It is across the globe. And so because of that, when it comes to talking about anything to do with gender, we have to be extremely alert. We have to be very concerted in our efforts. And we have to have a sense of urgency. So I think that's the backdrop that I come to this gathering with, very mindful of. Now, when we're talking about the midterm review of the Sendai Framework, there's key objective 9 within the Sendai Gender Action Plan, which focuses on ensuring access to sexual and reproductive health services, and also the prevention and response to gender-based violence in disaster contexts. Every disaster, it is the face of a woman or a girl who disproportionately bears the brunt of that disaster. We all know that. That's what the evidence points to. And so they are even more likely to die in a disaster compared to men. The disruption of essential health services often leads to a lack of access to life-saving sexual and reproductive health services, and the prevalence of gender-based violence often escalates during a disaster moment. So prioritizing these services is not just a policy decision, it's actually life-saving. And we can't use population numbers or distance or costs as excuse on these matters. So UNFPA, we very much welcome the adoption of the Sendai Gender Action Plan, and I want to pay tribute to the UN Office for DRR and UN Women for partnering with us on getting that plan to where it is now. But you ask about a shift. So I think the shift really is to shift our focus to make sure that we have a strategic, comprehensive and effective implementation of that action plan at all levels. And to accelerate the work, there are 3 things that I feel we need to prioritize. The first is we have to ensure that our efforts from the very early onset of crises to resilience building, that they are interconnected and that they're addressing the full spectrum of needs without gaps. So that means we need a very coordinated approach where every mechanism supports the other. And that's why UNFPA applies a multi-layered approach to disaster risk reduction that includes resilience building, early warning systems, and immediate response with life-saving services. So, for example, our pre-positioning, regional pre-positioning initiative in collaboration with the Government of Australia, that ensures that essential sexual and reproductive health and gender-based violence response supplies are ready for immediate distribution during emergencies. That shortens the response times. So, for instance, in Indonesia, following the Cianjur earthquake in 2023, dignity kits, which provide essential elements for women and girls, these were distributed within less than 24 hours of the government's request for support. And the birthing tent that we put up in place, that was fully operational within 48 hours after the earthquake. Enhancing early warning systems is also crucial, and at UNFPA we are training community volunteers to disseminate gender-sensitive early warning messages. So, for example, in Bangladesh, our anticipatory action program equips communities with vital risk information, including safe shelter locations and gender-based violence response services. We also recognize that building resilience is equally important. So, for instance, in Fiji, we're providing items in some of the outer islands there, such as sewing machines and brush cutters. These resources enable women and youth to engage in income-generating activities, like producing reusable menstrual pads. And by meeting menstrual health needs with sustainable solutions, these initiatives not only boost livelihoods, but they also enhance that community capacity to adapt to climate impacts and help foster resilience. Secondly, as part of all these efforts, we need to strengthen national capacities. This equips governments and stakeholders to tailor responses to local contexts, enabling effective action without reliance on external support. UNFPA is prioritizing enhancing these capacities, empowering countries and communities to tackle the unique challenges that they face. So we collaborate very closely, for example, with national women's organizations and women-led groups. But it's beyond equality and inclusion, it is also about equity. And so by integrating the grassroots insights and leadership into our strategies, we're able to enhance the disaster risk governance and ensure that we have a more responsive and inclusive approach. And the same goes for people with disabilities, from people with diverse genders. They also need to be consulted and included, but we have to be extremely intentional and we have to be accountable to those communities, because this isn't just about inclusivity. And thirdly, I would say that we have to strengthen our evidence base. UNFPA works very closely with national statistical offices across the globe to collect accurate and disaggregated data on critical factors such as age, sex, income, disability, all of which are very vital in terms of understanding the unique challenges that are faced by various groups. And by leveraging this information, we can customize our strategies to effectively meet needs, but also that data brings a lot of clarity whenever parliamentarians, the executive branch, the Minister for Finance, private sector, when they sit down to look at investments, the data tells its own very factual story about where the needs are and where those targeted investments need to be made. But of course, at UNFPA, we recognize that we can't do any of this alone. And so we really do encourage all stakeholders who are in this room and beyond, but including governments, our members of parliament, our local governments, civil society, the private sector, everyone. Everyone needs to see themselves in this work and to support that implementation of an interconnected approach, strengthening national capacities, enhancing the collection and the good use of data. Collaboration really is essential. I think we need to get back to that, back to good, honest collaboration among stakeholders. Disaster risk reduction actors must also actively engage with gender stakeholders. We heard earlier from one of our esteemed speakers, the need to break down silos and mindsets on a lot of these issues. That's really important if we're going to foster that shared sense of responsibility. And also, let's put it on the table. When we're coming to gender issues, we can't do this without our men and boys. So men need to speak up and men need to step up on a lot of these issues, particularly those with platform or a position of power. So I think if we take all of these actions, Rhonda, then we're going to be able to not only safeguard a lot of the past achievements that many of you and all our predecessors have worked very hard to put in place, but also I think that we ensure that no one is going to be left behind in the future responses. When we're working together, I'm really confident that we can create that lasting change and impact. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Pio. And it's consistent with some of the perspectives from the Pacific around this work and the Gender Action Plan itself, in the need for coherence and consistency and alignment with government policies and all of the stuff we're doing. That this takes time. It takes time, and we need to allow for that time. It needs to be contextual. These things are really important when they're more intentional and contextual for the community, for the province, for the island, for the country. And we have to be realistic, including what it costs to make these shifts and changes. We are guided and governed often by project cycles and donor funding that is 5 to 3 years. And so how do we make these lasting shifts beyond those cycles that are more longer viewed, programmatic in nature, that brings all of these threads together? So thank you for that sharing. I'd now like to turn to our next speaker, Nayab Ali. And we've completely blown our time to the organizers, so I'm asking for a little bit of indulgence here. Okay, I got a thumbs up from Gabby, we're all good. I'd like to turn to you, Nayab. Noticeable progress has been made since 2015 on incorporating the voices of diverse women in DRR governance structures. But the contributions they make to building resilience in communities are often overlooked. How are the unique knowledge and perspectives of women in all their diversity being reflected in DRR planning and initiatives in Pakistan? The floor is yours, Nayab.
Thank you very much. This is a very important question, and you mentioned diverse women. Let me unpack it a little bit more. Like, when you talk about diverse women, it's a spectrum, and it include transgender women, the queer women, indigenous women. So at largely, yes, you're right, like there's a lot of contribution and it's a lot of inclusion of women at large in DRR governance structure. But there is a lot of other factors that are hindering the mainstream inclusion of such vulnerable groups. So, for example, like if I will say Pakistan has redefined the meaning of gender equality. Why I'm saying it, like we have a progressive legislation which provides foundation for gender equality. For example, on the name of Transgender Rights Protection Act, it states that right to self-perceived gender identity, which allows everyone just go to the registration authority and get it registered according to his or her or them self-perceived gender identity. You don't need to go through the medical gatekeeping and all that. So this is the basic foundation of gender equality when we are defining diverse women. And this allows the non-discrimination. This allows further not only exclusion for further marginalization. So this is the basic foundation of the inclusion of diverse women in the mainstream disaster risk response. So let me share some good examples. So as many of you know, back in 2022, Pakistan was, there was a flood that put 33 million Pakistani homeless. And to be homeless, it was really worse experience for us, and it is very challenging for us how to address these issues, and especially when you are woman and you are wearing another badge of marginalization. You are a transgender woman, or you are a Khwaja woman. So this was little bit, not little bit, but it was quite challenging for us. But at that time, National Disaster Management Authority, Government of Pakistan, and with a lot of collaboration with other organization, which was the community-led organization, we developed a national safety net to protect those vulnerable groups. And in that result, so we see, when we were in the field, and we were witnessing that there was a lot of, the government relief efforts were delayed. But when we reached there and we met the community, and community was saying, can you just drain this flood water from our hometowns? And we just need that because we are much resilient to rehabilitate ourselves. We will rebuild our homes. We will restart our economic earning, or we just want to be more financial self-dependent. So this was a community resilience that we witnessed. So the Pakistani government, and the organization like us, they come up this very community-driven solution. So when you really include diversity, and when you really include transgender person and gender diverse women, it really helps. For example, in Sendai Framework, I really like the whole of society approach, right? The whole of society approach, but you not often heard these diverse perspective into the policy making. You don't heard such diverse perspective in the governance structure. But to be very honest, when you really include, you see the endorsement of special needs, identification of special perspective, diverse perspective. The DRR governance structure is not one fit for all approach. It shouldn't be, but unfortunately in countries, majority countries, it is driven by this formula, like it's one fit for all. But obviously, women need special protection. Women needs special needs. For example, the diverse women, they require, for example, transgender women, they need to be addressed in a dignified way from my preferred pronouns. So this is the something unique perspective that really need to be incorporated, and I will just relate it to the some indigenous perspective, and I will give you some examples of that. For example, the sister girls in Australia. So they were their indigenous knowledge about wildfire management, and likewise the Pakistani Khwajasara community, their knowledge about ecological preservance and weather forecasting. So, and also the community, the interlinked community aid model that we utilized in our disaster risk governance structure. So it was really helpful. And there's a lot of challenges. I will just conclude it here, but it's a lot of challenges that we are living in the adversity and in the light of global anti-gender movement, when the inclusion of gender diverse women is considered to the threat to the traditional ideology and traditional values. So, but it is very hard to include that, but in Pakistan, we are really striving, and we, I think Pakistan is the best case study for inclusion of gender diversity to the mainstream DRR response. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nayab. And there's so many parallels with that integration between using indigenous knowledge in DRR and leaving no one behind, especially as it relates to the appreciation of women in all their diversity in this space. There's parallels in the Pacific region, there's parallels in the Asian region, and so we thank you for that sharing and those reflections. Our final panel member, Kristen, who's rearing up the team for us today. The midterm review of the Sendai Framework found there were insufficient resources available to reduce the disaster risks we face in the context of climate change. At the same time, we know that the gender equality and disability inclusion agenda are also under-resourced. Given the insufficient resources for both disaster risk reduction and gender equality, disability inclusion, what role can partners play in addressing these issues hand in hand? The floor is yours, Kristen.
Thanks very much, Rhonda, and thanks to the Philippines government and to UNDRR for putting on this excellent conversation, and I've learned a lot from the esteemed panellists already, so thank you. Look, Rhonda, I guess I'll answer the question in the context of the conversations and the meetings I go to, which is typically around engaging internationally and with national governments on climate change. Obviously, we all understand the very strong link between climate impacts and the need for effective and broad DRR. But I guess I think about the way you ask the question, which is this real pressing problem of lack of resources. And when you think about the question that way, I guess my answer is less focused on the very important social justice aspect of leaving no one behind. But when you are trying to respond to a significant and growing challenge such as climate change, why would you not want your full team working in the same direction? So why would you not want to try and tackle the problem with all the economic resources, but certainly all the human resources that the full breadth of society brings? So certainly gender in all its diversity, people with disability, First Nations and Indigenous communities, etc. I'll give 2 examples, again, drawing on the conversations and the observations in the international climate space that I've been involved in. So firstly, and this is a little bit of a personal longitudinal study that I've been privileged to be part of, which was when I first was involved in the international climate discussions in 2005, which was my first UN climate COP. Pacific negotiators were not very prominent in the climate discussions, and certainly female Pacific negotiators were almost unseen sitting behind the microphone. Often they were in the back row supporting or taking notes for their senior Pacific men delegates. And there was an initiative at the time that Australia and other countries were pleased to support, which was training female climate negotiators in the region and in the Pacific. Fast forward sort of 15, 17 years when I re-engaged in the international climate negotiations in this role a couple of years ago, and I turned up at my first COP back in this role in 2022, and not only was the Pacific very prominent, very influential, and speaking with such significant moral authority on climate change and the need for stronger global action and more effective responses, but female Pacific delegates and negotiators were often behind the microphone. And that my own personal observation in that sort of 15-year gap was something was working and was working well, and that was having an impact and a real discernible, demonstrable power on driving stronger global action on climate change. If I extrapolate that example to a study I read recently that showed that in parliaments, national parliaments, where there are more women, those governments have more ambitious climate policies. And in our own country, in Australia, where right now our current government and parliament is majority women, and again, having worked in the Australian government on climate change for most of the last 20 years, can personally attest to the fact that our current government has the most ambitious climate policies we've had in history, then I think those are the sorts of evidence and examples that I've observed that when you have much more meaningful participation and inclusion, in this case of women in all their diversity, you are going to have more ambitious and more socially minded public policy responses to climate and DRR that we know are essential. Thank you.
Thanks, Kirsten. And I might share 2 words you shared with me before we took the stage today. I asked each of the panel members that I had the opportunity to talk to, if you were to leave us with 1 or 2 words or thoughts, what would they be? And so Kirsten shared with me, her words were, be brave. And I think that's really resonating, particularly in the first story you talked about with women in the climate negotiation space. I mean, the community that are engaging in those negotiations now are walking in the footsteps of those women who led the way for us in the Pacific region, and I know some of them, so thank you for that, and thank you for that sharing. Ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of the question and answer session for this panel. I do have a few concluding remarks, which I'll try to keep really brief. So if you'll indulge me for a little bit more. We would have loved to have another round of questions with our panel members, but unfortunately time was not on our side today. So if you don't mind, I'd like to just wrap this up for us all. As we conclude this pivotal session on leaving no one behind, I want to extend my heartfelt gratitude to our distinguished speakers, panelists, and participants for their invaluable contributions. We have delved into the importance of inclusive and equitable disaster risk governance, emphasizing that our efforts must encompass the diverse needs and perspectives of all individuals and communities and all of society. We've heard compelling insights on adaptive social protection, integration, and the nuanced challenges faced by our marginalized groups. We've heard perspectives from the government of Philippines, across the keynote speakers and yourself, Diana, about the highlighting your Government of Philippines' efforts in scaling up social protection to bolster disaster resilience among your highly vulnerable groups. PO, you emphasized the importance of gender equality and social inclusion as key priorities to accelerate the implementation of the Sendai Framework and the need for strategic, comprehensive, and effective implementation of the Gender Action Plan at all levels. And Caspar, you underscored the challenges faced by people with disabilities during disasters and the importance of including your voice, your perspectives, and your advocacy efforts for policy development and disaster risk reduction initiatives at the country level. As we all move forward, we continue to foster collaboration and partnerships at all levels, and this is really important. We must work together to ensure our policies and strategies are not only inclusive, but actionable and impactful. The integration of local, traditional, and indigenous knowledge, as well as the active participation, intentional active participation of women, persons with disabilities, and other marginalized groups are essential in building our community resilience. This isn't just about inclusivity for inclusivity's sake, but strengthening inclusivity is essential for effectiveness of our collective resilience efforts. Vinaka Vakalevu, thank you for your dedication and your participation, and let's enjoy the rest of the week with each other as we move through the next few sessions. Thank you, everyone.